Robert Clive's reputation as a controversial figure began even during his lifetime. We will discuss two major approaches to the figure, one that lauds him as a military hero and empire-building statesman, and the other that sees him as a corrupt man who ignored famine while he got rich. Clive was famous for his military exploits both at the Siege of Arcot and Battle of Plassey. The latter led to the East India Company's rule of Bengal, where Clive became a statesman. However, his actions during this time were later called into question by Parliament. While never being charged with anything, Clive's reputation suffered, and he committed suicide in 1774. In this historiography, I will begin by examining the following sources that were mostly positive towards Clive. John Malcolm's The Life of Robert Lord Clive was one of the first major biographies written on the subject. The book was published posthumously in 1836, and its author was both an EIC servant and historian, which lent personal expertise to the text. His main source were Clive's documents and letters given to Malcolm by Clive's son, the Earl of Prowess. These two quotes illustrate Malcolm's perspective on Clive in that he portrays him as wrongly prosecuted. He presents an idea that Clive's downfall was a result of his necessary actions and perhaps a misjudging by Parliament. More recent examinations like that of Evgenia Sifaki have asserted that Malcolm's essay produced a grand and rather romantic image of Clive, with respect to both his military genius and his private life and character. Thomas Macaulay wrote Lord Clive in 1840 as a response to Malcolm's book. He was a British historian and Whig politician, so this colored his opinion of both Clive and Malcolm. As recent critics have noted, Macaulay was known for using his reviews to judge not only the subject, but also the author. These quotations contrast Macaulay's approach from Malcolm's, as Macaulay is more critical. However, Macaulay still lends a generous depiction of Clive's military exploits, being far more critical towards his role as a statesman. Recently, Safaki has noted that to Macaulay, an ultimate Victorian hero was not a militaristic warrior, but a statesman, and that can account for the harsher judgment. Harrington adds that extra animosity towards Malcolm was fueled by their opposing political views. This poem was written by Browning in 1880. It has two main protagonists, Clive and a narrator who judges his actions and desires. The poem is set around Clive's death and serves as a recapitulation of his life. As Browning was a romantic poet, this influenced his perspective on Clive. This quote reveals the belief that Clive succumbed to opiates and depression in his last days. Today, critics like Safaki see this as an undermining of his legacy. However, it truly captures the tragic heroism imbued in Clive, and the reason he was regarded as such a legend of the day.
In this section, we will examine the criticism of Robert Clive during his life and the resulting effects it had on his legacy. While biographies were written of Clive that showed support for the Lord, very little sources can be found that critique his actions. However, opposition to his character can be found in parliamentary records, where Clive was subject to an inquiry from the government about his actions in India. Clive's greatest opponent was General Burgoyne, who detested the man and said, "Lord Clive has abused the power with which he was entrusted with to the evil example of all servants of the public." By the end of 1772, Parliament had concluded that Clive was not responsible for the corruption of the East India Company and was cleared of all charges. Some dissenting opinions were recorded, including Charles James Fox, who continued to attack Clive even as he retired from service.
In recent historiography, positive views of Robert Clive have been primarily influenced by aforementioned works. Instead of looking solely at primary sources, recent scholars have taken to reassessing previously published works comparatively in order to flesh out a fuller understanding of Clive and his life. As a result, positive views of Robert Clive still admire his achievements as feats of genius, while still acknowledging how and why these achievements might be dubious or ill-conceived. This marks the change in modern interpretation and historiography of Robert Clive. Where he was previously lauded as a hero in his entirety, that image has been tempered with the realities of his actions according to modern morals. Evgenia Sifaki compares Macaulay and Malcolm's Victorian interpretations of Clive as a heroic figure, attempting to understand the reasoning for popular opinion at the time. She writes, "Stories of historical figures were often fictionalized and presented almost entirely in terms of myth in order to inspire the heroic idea, and Clive was particularly popular with history teachers because he could be represented as achieving greatness through a boyish delight in adventure." Her essay, Masculinity, Heroism, and the Empire's Intention, is obviously not an appraisal of Clive's intriguing career. Rather, she reads 19th century texts which rewrite parts of Clive's story as partaking in a Victorian debate. Safaki's examination of these works and the purpose they served at the time they were written helps to bring a certain sense of modern realism to Clive as a historic person. In the preface to his book Clive, C. Brad Fott says his examination of Clive seeks to place Clive squarely in the run of the times in which he lived. Fott goes on to say that no telling of Clive's life can be considered complete without recognizing that alongside the contemporary military and commercial achievements were features of his character that were not the least bit attractive, not then and not now. Fortunately, at this late remove from the age in which he lived, Clive's life can be examined without the need to justify or excoriate, but rather simply try to understand his motivations and actions. Fott's Clive brings an aspect of realism to a near-legendary historical figure. These works and others are the result of modern historiography, examining past works and sources to find the truth of Clive as a person, not through his projected image, but through the possible reasons for his actions in their entirety.
Even in his own time, Clive was both celebrated and vilified. This mixed legacy was to endure into the 20th century, and even into our own. While certainly not a popular figure in Indian history today on the level of, say, Gandhi or other independence-era heroes, Clive's central importance to the history of British India endures. In 1935, he was the subject of a Hollywood drama, which took considerable liberties with the historical facts, but nonetheless perpetuated the image of him as a tortured, but ultimately successful general and conqueror. Even in his own time, Clive was both celebrated and vilified. This mixed legacy was to endure into the 20th century, and even into our own. While certainly not a popular or revered figure in Indian history today by any means, on the level of, say, Gandhi, Clive's central importance in the history of British India endures. In 1935, he was the subject of a Hollywood drama, which took some pretty considerable liberties with the historical facts, but nonetheless perpetuated the image of him as a tortured, but ultimately successful general and conqueror. To this day, a popular brand of British curry powder is marketed using his likeness, continuing the association between his name and the Indian influence on British culture, and, in 2011, a National Army Museum event proclaimed him to be one of Britain's greatest generals. Into the 20th century, assessments of Clive's legacy have taken a turn for the worse. The idea, so dearly held by many before, that Clive's victory at Plassey heralded a new era of British rule, and therefore civilization, has been discredited, due in large part to the emergence of Indian scholars in writing their own colonial history. However, scholars such as Nigel Joseph have increasingly focused on Clive's reception in Britain itself, and what it meant for Britain's emerging perception of itself as a global imperial power. This is in fact one area where the older scholarship and current scholarship are broadly in agreement. To this day, Robert Clive is indisputably seen as the instigator of formal East India Company rule in India. In his forthcoming book, The Anarchy, or How a Corporation Replaced the Mughal Empire, popular Scottish Indian historian William Dalrymple seeks to compare Clive's efforts in establishing company rule over India with what he perceives as the heavy-handed power of multinational corporations and banks in the present day. This work was excerpted in The Guardian under the headline The East India Company, the Original Corporate Raiders, perhaps reflecting the current anxieties over today's unrestrained private sector influence over the public sphere, very much like the parliamentarians who put Clive on trial upon his return from the subcontinent. It seems like attacks on Clive today still reflect a good deal of this current generation's worries for the state of our own society, just as his trial in the 18th century did for people of that day. Although the full text of Dalrymple's book has yet to appear, it can tell us one very important thing about Clive's legacy. Love him or hate him, no one denies that he was a seminal figure in the history of British India.